Hey guys, tonight we wander into the most pungent myth of all, this idea that in the Middle Ages, people just never bathed. The cliché paints them as human onions, layer upon layer of sweat and dirt, trudging through life in a haze of stink. Picture yourself stepping into a crowded medieval market, horses steaming, bread burning, people shoulder to shoulder. The air itself feels like a punchline to a bad joke. You probably wouldn't survive this odor without keeling over in the cabbage cart. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to subscribe, because if you don't, tomorrow's story will simply vanish from your feed. And trust me, you don't want to miss it. Drop your location and the local time in the comments too. I want to know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The myth is simple. Medieval folk avoided water like it carried curses, choosing instead to stew in their own grime. It's the ultimate horror story for anyone who treasures soap. Medieval body spray. Just standing further away. Here's the truth. While daily showers weren't a thing, people weren't as allergic to water as the myth suggests. Bathing rituals tied into religion, medicine, and even social status. They didn't sparkle like toothpaste commercials, but they weren't swamp creatures either. In 13th century Paris, records describe more than 24 public bathhouses, some heated with wood-fired furnaces, steam wafting through candlelit rooms. Wealthy nobles sometimes bathed in rose-infused water, floating petals like a medieval spa day. Historians still argue whether peasants bathed weekly or just seasonally. Archaeology finds soap residues, while satirical poems mocked farmers for their smell. The truth? Likely a messy middle ground. You step into a wooden cottage, where a mother tips a kettle of boiling water into a small tub. Children wait their turn, one after another, splashing like ducklings. It isn't glamorous, it's survival. Remember that market stench we started with? Turns out, even those fishmongers probably rinsed in the river when they could, though maybe not often enough for your 21st century nose. Shampoo brand of choice rainwater. Medieval hairdryer, just the wind through the cracks in the wall. But if everyone wasn't reeking every day, why do legends insist that castles stank worse than dungeons? That's where we head next. You've heard the second myth, that castles, those towering stone fortresses, reeked so badly that even dungeons smelled fresher. Popular imagination paints them as giant toilets, where nobles sloshed through their own waste, tapestries absorbing centuries of stench. You picture yourself climbing a spiral staircase, torches flickering. The air so damp and foul, it makes you gag before reaching the banquet hall. If Febreze had existed, it would have declared bankruptcy. The truth, however, is more complicated. Castles weren't air-conditioned palaces, sure, but they weren't permanent stink bombs either. Medieval builders engineered clever ways to manage odors. Garderobes that funneled waste straight down chutes, cesspits carefully placed away from living quarters, and servants tasked specifically with cleaning. It wasn't modern plumbing, but it was an attempt at dignity. Historical fact: in the Tower of London, records show that royal masons maintained drainage systems so complex they had to be inspected regularly. They didn't always succeed, but people tried harder than the myth allows. Quirky detail: nobles sometimes sprinkled rushes on the floor, not just for insulation but for fragrance. layering herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask smells. Debate. Historians still argue whether garderobes genuinely improved hygiene or simply shifted the problem to the moat below. Some claim castle courtyards reeked from waste drainage. Others insist complaints were exaggerated propaganda written by rivals. Imagine yourself in the role of a kitchen boy lugging buckets of ash to scatter across greasy flagstones. The scent of roasting meat mingles with sharp herbs, covering the traces of last night's feast. The hall isn't spotless, but it isn't the cesspit the myths promised either. Callback time. Remember that marketplace we walked through earlier? Compared to the hustle of unwashed peasants and animal dung, a castle, though musty, might actually smell a little better. Joke 1. Welcome to my castle. Please mind the moat. It doubles as the bathroom. Joke 2. Medieval air freshener. Just open a window and hope the wind blows the other way. Joke 3. Forget chandeliers. What every banquet needed was one giant scented candle. Cliffhanger. So if castles weren't giant latrines, why do so many stories claim people were terrified of water itself? That paranoia takes us straight to rivers and fears of bathing. The next myth claims medieval people avoided rivers because they believed water itself was dangerous. The story goes that villagers tiptoed past streams like they were bubbling cauldrons of disease, terrified to dip a single toe. Picture yourself walking along a wide medieval riverbank, mud squelching under your boots, laundry lines fluttering overhead, and supposedly nobody dares to wash. If that were true, the entire countryside would have been one giant mud ball of humanity. Here's the flip. Rivers weren't just used, they were lifelines. Yes, they carried risks, pollution, waste, and even spiritual fears, but they also offered the most practical access to water for drinking, cleaning, and ritual. Bathing wasn't a daily dip, but neither was it a forbidden act. People trusted rivers enough to build entire livelihoods around them. Historical fact: in 14th century London, the Thames hosted regular washing rituals, with fishmongers, tanners, and ordinary townsfolk all rinsing themselves or their goods. Quirky tidbit: some towns organized feast day swims, treating river bathing as communal celebration. Debate: historians still argue whether frequent river use actually spread more disease or if those accusations came later. Once plague paranoia reframed the past. Some insist medieval people blamed rivers unfairly for illnesses caused by crowded living. Step inside the viewpoint of a weary washerwoman. She kneels at the water's edge, beating cloth against a flat stone, suds running downstream. Children splash beside her, shrieking at the cold current. The river isn't feared, it's a noisy, messy, necessary friend. Callback. Remember the castle moat we joked about in the last section? Well, rivers were the healthier cousins, sometimes polluted, sometimes refreshing, but never ignored. Joke 1. Medieval lifeguard training. Yell really loudly and hope someone listens. Joke 2. Sunscreen of choice. A wide-brimmed hat and a prayer. Joke 3. Fitness plan. Wash laundry in a river and call it arm day. Cliffhanger. If rivers were trusted, then why do so many stories insist people lived without soap altogether? That myth is coming next, and it's slipperier than you think. The myth here is blunt. Medieval people lived in a soapless void, scrubbing with nothing but sand or scratching dirt off like bears on tree trunks. You imagine a peasant at the river, dunking himself, shaking like a wet dog, and calling it a bath. If this were true, the entire Middle Ages would have smelled like one endless sports locker after a thunderstorm. Now for the flip. Soap existed, and it wasn't just a luxury. People across Europe made rough blocks of it from animal fat and lye, sometimes perfumed with herbs when supplies allowed. It wasn't foamy like modern bars, but it did the job. Soap making was even a regulated trade by the 12th century, with guilds in cities like Marseille and Naples producing batches for sale. Historical fact: documents from the 13th century mention English soap makers paying taxes on their craft, proof the business was profitable enough to track. Quirky tidbit: some recipes mixed ashes with goat fat, creating a grayish paste that doubled as stain remover for both clothes and skin. Scholarly debate: historians still argue whether soap was commonly used for personal hygiene or mainly for laundry. Some insist peasants rarely used it on their bodies. Others point to archaeological traces of soap near wells and baths. Now step into a small medieval kitchen. A pot bubbles over the fire, not with stew, but with a thick, pungent mixture of fat and ashes. A woman stirs slowly, her arms aching, while a child wrinkles his nose at the smell. The final lump is ugly, crumbly, but precious. It will scrub away grime for weeks. Callback: remember that washerwoman by the river in the last section? She likely rubbed her laundry with these rough soap lumps, not just splashed water. Medieval cleaning had more chemistry than legend admits. Joke 1. Medieval body wash, now available in 1-cent barnyard. Joke 2. Foam, forget it. You got more bubbles from sneezing. Joke 3. Marketing slogan, strong enough for your tunic, gentle enough for your armpits. Cliffhanger: but if soap existed, why do we hear so many tales of nobles drowning themselves in perfume instead? That's the next twist. The myth says nobles were so disgustingly dirty they drowned themselves in perfume to mask the stink. Walking clouds of musk drifting through banquet halls. You picture a medieval lord striding past in velvet robes, the smell hitting you before the sight like a walking incense burner with shoes. According to legend, baths were skipped, perfume was poured, and everybody gagged politely. Here's the flip. Yes, perfume mattered, but not as a desperate cover-up. Scents were tied to medicine, class, and ritual. People believed certain herbs purified the air, keeping away disease and evil spirits. Perfume wasn't a medieval deodorant, it was a status symbol, a way to signal refinement and wealth. Historical fact: in 14th century courts, nobles imported perfumed oils from the Islamic world, prized for their exotic blends of musk and amber. Quirky tidbit: some perfumes were stored in pomander-steiny metal balls filled with scented herbs that nobles carried or wore on chains. Debate: historians still argue whether perfume use meant hygiene neglect, or if it simply layered on top of regular bathing habits. Satirical writers loved exaggerating, but inventories of noble estates list both bathing tubs and perfume stores side by side. Step inside the chamber of a wealthy lady. She opens a carved box, lifting a vial of rose oil. Servants heat water for her bath in the adjoining room, and afterward she dabs her wrists with the oil. To her, perfume completes the ritual. It isn't a replacement for soap, it's a flourish. Callback: Remember that lump of goat fat soap we talked about? Imagine scrubbing first with that gray paste, then finishing with rose oil. Not glamorous, but surprisingly layered for an era we assume was filth incarnate. Joke 1. Medieval perfume commercial. Now with 20% fewer fleas. Joke 2. OD Castle Moat. Limited edition. Joke 3. Forget subtle notes of citrus. Think herbs, musk, and a hint of sheep. Cliffhanger. But while nobles dabbed oils and peasants splashed rivers, what about their teeth? Weren't they all toothless grinners by age 30? That's the next myth to crack. The myth paints medieval mouths as horror shows blackened stumps, missing teeth, breath that could knock over a horse. You imagine villagers flashing smiles that looked more like fence posts after a storm, nobles gnawing on meat with gums alone. If toothpaste didn't exist, surely everyone was toothless by 30. Flip that around. Dental care existed, even if crude. People chewed herbs, rinsed with wine, and used powders made from ground-up chalk or crushed bones. No fluoride, no minty gels, but enough awareness to try. Teeth weren't perfect, but they weren't universally rotten either. Historical fact: manuscripts from the 12th century describe tooth powders made of salt and sage, rubbed with cloths or twigs. Quirky tidbit: some remedies suggested rubbing teeth with burned hare's head or powdered ashes from snails. Unpleasant, but creative. Scholarly debate: some argue medieval diets actually helped teeth, since sugar was rare before the late Middle Ages. Others point to skeletons showing cavities, rising sharply only once sugar imports grew. Step into the life of a barber surgeon. In his cramped booth, he sharpens an iron tool, offering to pull aching teeth. Outside, a merchant quietly chews fennel seeds to freshen his breath before greeting customers. Not glamorous, but it shows people cared. Callback: remember that noble lady with rose oil? She likely rinsed her mouth with spiced wine after bathing, layering scent inside and out. Cleanliness was more rounded than the myth allows. Joke 1. Medieval toothbrush. A twig with ambition. Joke 2. Floss. Just hope that chicken bone wiggles loose eventually. Joke 3. Colgate's slogan of the day: less rot, more rosemary. Cliffhanger: and while teeth got some attention, what about hair and beards? The myth says everyone looked like shaggy wolves. That's where we head next. The myth insists medieval folk all looked like wild wolvesmen with beards tangled into nests. Women's hair, greasy ropes, peasants more beast than human. You picture a muddy farmer scratching his chin, half his dinner still stuck in the bristles, while his hair flows like an unwashed curtain. If shampoo didn't exist, surely everyone resembled a scarecrow. Now the flip. Grooming was serious business, and not just for nobles. Barbers cropped hair, trimmed beards, and doubled as surgeons. Women washed and combed regularly, often braiding hair or covering it with veils. Grease happened, dirt happened, but complete neglect, rare. A messy appearance could mark you as poor or even sinful. Historical fact: by the 13th century, barber guilds were operating in cities, regulated and recognized as important tradesmen. Quirky tidbit: some barbers advertised by hanging bloody rags outside their shops, a grisly but effective sign. Debate: historians argue whether peasants could afford regular barber care or mostly handled grooming at home. Some records suggest village women shared combs and oils, while wealthier men paid for sharper trims. Slip into the role of a barber's apprentice. You hold a basin while your master shaves a knight, carefully scraping with a sharpened blade. The knight winces, but he'll leave looking sharp, his beard tamed before a feast. Across town, a peasant girl braids her sister's hair, humming softly as she works. Callback. Remember that washerwoman pounding clothes by the river? Her comb likely hung from her belt, as essential as her laundry stone. Hygiene extended from clothes to hair, not skipped. Joke 1. Medieval hair gel. Goose, fat stylish, if you don't mind smelling like dinner. Joke 2. Bad hair day solution. Just call it a holy vow. Joke 3. Barbershop reviews. 5 stars if you survive the haircut. Cliffhanger. If grooming mattered this much, why do we hear myths about entire towns without bathhouses? That steamy secret comes next. The myth here says medieval Europe had no public bathhouses at all, that people were too terrified of water, too poor, or too ignorant to build such places. You imagine a whole continent wandering around like a crowd of mud golems, the only steam rising from kitchens, never from tubs. If that were true, the word bath itself would have been forgotten for centuries. But the flip is striking. Bathhouses were everywhere, bustling, steamy social hubs where people bathed, relaxed, and gossiped. In cities, they were as common as taverns. Sure, not every village had one, but larger towns often hosted several, complete with heated water and candlelight. Some were plain wooden sheds, others intricate stone houses with tiled pools. Historical fact: by the 13th century, Paris boasted dozens of public bathhouses documented in civic records. They were open to men and women, sometimes together, sometimes at separate hours. Quirky tidbit: some bathhouses even served food and wine, turning the experience into something between a spa and a party. Scholarly debate, historians argue. Whether bathhouses fell out of favor solely because of plague paranoia, or because moral authorities condemned them as dens of sin, evidence shows both concerns played roles. Step into a steamy wooden room, lanterns flickering on damp walls. You lower yourself into hot water while voices echo around you, merchants talking trade, women laughing, a minstrel humming. The air smells of soap, herbs, and cooked meat drifting in from the kitchen next door. This is no fantasy, it's routine medieval life. Callback. Remember our joke about castles needing scented candles? Here, whole tubs of steaming water did the job, warming body and spirit alike. Joke 1. Medieval spa package. Hot water, gossip, and a side of stew. Joke 2. Admission fee. 1 coin and a tolerance for pruny fingers. Joke 3. Don't forget your tallow weight. That's what your tunic is for. Cliffhanger. But if public baths flourished, why did plague rumors blame filth for spreading death? That clash of cleanliness and catastrophe is next. The myth blames medieval filth entirely for the Black Death, as if the plague was punishment for dirty bodies and unwashed streets. In this telling, every unbathed villager carried doom in their hair. Every clogged gutter sent death marching. You imagine a town square buzzing with fleas, neighbors pointing fingers, whispering, "If only we'd bathed more." But here's the flip. The plague's arrival in Europe was far more complex. Filth may have worsened conditions, but the disease was driven by fleas on rats. Ships carrying cargo and crowded trade routes. Cleanliness alone couldn't have stopped it. People did link dirt to illness, but they didn't understand microbes. They fought what they could see, even if the real killer was too small for their eyes. Historical fact: records from the mid-14th century show city councils ordering street cleaning during plague years, proving people believed filth was part of the problem. Quirky tidbit: some towns even paid rakers to sweep refuse at night, throwing it beyond the walls, like medieval sanitation trucks without the truck. Debate: historians still argue whether bathing itself helped or harmed. Some claim open pores made people more vulnerable, while others insist regular washing offered some protection. Step into the mind of a frightened monk. In 1348, he watches bodies carried past the monastery gates, clutching a sprig of rosemary to his nose. He remembers washing his hands in holy water, wondering if it will keep him safe. Callback: remember that crowded bathhouse from our last section? When plague swept through, those very steam rooms became suspicious, even feared were they healing or deadly traps. Joke 1. Medieval health tip: avoid fleas. Easier said than done. Joke 2. Doctor's advice: don't breathe. Very practical. Joke 3. Sanitation plan: throw the trash outside the walls and pray it doesn't crawl back. Cliffhanger: but what about those monks themselves? Weren't holy men supposed to live in filth as a vow of humility? The reality might surprise you. The myth insists monks swore themselves to dirt-holy men in rough wool, never washing, never trimming, never caring for the body, because they thought purity was only spiritual. Picture a cloister where the chanting is serene, but the smell could peel paint. According to this view, monks deliberately marinated in grime, convinced heaven cared nothing for soap. But the flip is more nuanced. Monastic rules varied, and many required hygiene, not neglect. Some orders instructed weekly baths, careful shaving, and clean clothes. Cleanliness wasn't vanity, it was discipline, an ordered life in service of God. True, extreme ascetics sometimes rejected bathing, but they were the exception, not the rule. For most monasteries, dirt symbolized disorder, not devotion. Historical fact: the rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many monasteries from the 6th century onward, specifically recommended regular washings before meals and at certain holy times. Monks might not have bathed daily, but they rinsed hands and faces often, sometimes even heating water for communal baths. Quirky tidbit: some abbeys built elaborate stone bathhouses with running water diverted from nearby streams. In Cluny, France, records show entire bathing rooms set aside for monks' use. Debate: historians still argue whether strict Cistercian monks limited bathing more than Benedictines. Some argue their austerity led to dirtier habits. Others say they maintained rigorous hand-washing, even if full-body bathing was rare. Imagine yourself as a novice in a monastery. You rise before dawn, chant prayers, then follow your brothers to a stone washroom. Cold water splashes your face, jolting you awake. Later in the week, you wait your turn in a steamy chamber where hot water trickles into wooden tubs. The life is strict, but not filthy. Callback: remember the barber surgeon shaving nights? Monks, too, kept razors sharp, not for fashion, but to prevent lice. And just like those nobles with perfume, monks used herbs, rosemary or sage to scent their wash water. The myth of holy dirt lingers partly because extreme examples were memorable. Some anchorites and saints rejected bathing entirely, wearing filth as proof of their spiritual detachment. But for every hermit caked in mud, there were dozens of monks keeping their hands clean, their robes washed, and their heads shaven smooth. Joke 1. Monastic hair salon. One style fits all. Bald. Joke 2. Spa day at the abbey. Confession, chanting, and a cold bath. Joke 3. Monk-approved deodorant. A sprig of sage tucked in the robes. The rhythm of monastic life tied cleanliness to ritual. Before meals, you washed. Before prayer, you washed. Before sacred rites, you washed. It wasn't vanity, it was order. And if dirt appeared, it was usually from labor in gardens or fields, not from vows against bathing. Cliffhanger. But if monks cared for their bodies this way, what about medieval women? The myth says they were ignored, neglected, left to stew in unhygienic conditions. That assumption deserves its own unraveling. The myth claims medieval women were entirely ignored when it came to hygiene. Supposedly, they had no routines, no products, and no concern for cleanliness, just long dresses hiding dirt, hair matted under veils, and a permanent smell of smoke from the hearth. You picture a dim cottage where a mother stirs porridge with hands blackened from ash, never once pausing to wash. If that were true, every medieval marriage would have needed a clothespin for survival. Here's the flip. Women were active custodians of hygiene, both personal and domestic. From washing children in small tubs to preparing herbal rinses, women kept households running. Their routines might not resemble modern spa days, but they reveal constant attention to body and home. Far from being neglected, women often led the charge for historical fact. 14th century household manuals describe recipes for skin care and hair rinses, using herbs like chamomile, mint, and rosemary. Quirky tidbit: archaeological digs in medieval London uncovered bone and bronze combs, many found in areas associated with women's quarters. Debate: historians still argue whether such practices were widespread across all classes, or largely confined to urban and noble households. Some argue peasant women relied almost entirely on river washing, while others point to evidence of homemade herbal remedies. Slip into the life of a miller's wife. She kneels by a small barrel, pouring warm water to bathe her baby, then rubs her own hands with vinegar and herbs before kneading dough. Her work is endless, but so is her habit of cleaning as she goes. Callback. Remember the monk with rosemary tucked in his robe? Women used the same herbs to scent water for rinsing their hair, showing how hygiene overlapped between cloister and cottage. Joke 1. Medieval skincare routine. Wash face, avoid moat. Joke 2. Moisturizer of the day, animal fat. Joke 3. Medieval beauty ad, glowing skin, now with fewer fleas. Far from being passive, women transmitted hygiene knowledge, teaching daughters to braid hair, to scrub dishes with ash, to boil cloths before reuse. They weren't medieval beauty bloggers, but they laid the groundwork for survival and health. Cliffhanger. But what about clothes? Myths say peasants wore the same stiff, rotting garments all year until they fell apart. That's the next dirty assumption we need to wash clean. The myth here says medieval peasants wore the same filthy outfit for months or even years, until it practically fused with their skin. Supposedly, shirts rotted on their backs, wool cloaks crawled with vermin, and laundry was non-existent. You imagine a muddy field worker tugging at his tunic, only to find it has become part of him, stitched in place by sweat and time. If that were true, medieval Europe would have smelled worse than any battlefield. Now the flip. Clothes were indeed worn longer than modern fast fashion allows, but laundry was part of regular life. People washed, boiled, and beat garments clean, especially linen, which was the common underlayer for both rich and poor. Outer garments might not get frequent scrubbing, but linens underneath were swapped, washed, and dried in the sun. Historical fact: archaeological studies of cesspits in medieval London reveal soap residues mixed with fibers from linen garments. Clear signs of washing routines. Quirky tidbit: some people bleached linen by spreading it over meadows, letting sun and dew whiten the cloth naturally, a practice called crofting. Debate: historians still argue whether peasants laundered weekly or monthly. Records suggest variation. Urban dwellers had access to communal washhouses, while rural families relied on rivers, streams, or large cauldrons at home. Picture yourself in a village on wash day. Women gather by the river, pounding tunics against flat stones, lather rising as children splash nearby. Steam curls from a cauldron where heavier garments boil, ashes and soap stirred in. White linen flaps on bushes, drying in the breeze. The scene is noisy, messy, but undeniably hygienic. Callback: remember the goat fat soap from earlier? This is where it worked hardest, scrubbing out sweat and dirt from everyday clothes. Without it, linens would have disintegrated long before peasants wore them out. Joke 1: medieval washing machine. 2 strong arms and a rock. Joke 2: delicate cycle, don't let the cow step on it. Joke 3: laundry detergent, ashes, fat, and a whole lot of elbow grease. Another overlooked point: noble families employed laundresses. Women paid specifically to wash clothes, manage linens, and maintain wardrobes. This wasn't just vanity, it was necessity. Fresh linens reduced lice and skin infections, making clean clothes as much about health as appearance. And while peasants didn't have closets stuffed with outfits, they rotated what they owned. Undershirts were changed, dresses mended, cloaks patched. Clothes weren't disposable, but they weren't left to rot either. So, the myth of rotting clothes confuses thrift with filth. People cared for garments because making them was costly. Every tunic represented days of spinning, weaving, and sewing. Letting it rot away would have been as foolish as tossing out gold. Cliffhanger: but if clothes were washed, were there actual laws enforcing hygiene? Or was it still everyone for themselves? That's where we turn next. The myth says medieval towns had no hygiene rules at all, that people dumped chamber pots onto the street. Pigs rooted through garbage, and filth piled up until it swallowed whole neighborhoods. According to this idea, nobody cared, nobody enforced, and nobody noticed. You imagine yourself walking through a narrow alley, dodging falling waste from a window above, while rats scurry past your feet. If there were no rules, every street must have been a free-for-all sewer. But here's the flip. Medieval cities did have hygiene regulations, and many were surprisingly strict. Councils passed ordinances about waste disposal, water quality, and street cleaning. Enforcement wasn't perfect, but law existed. People argued, paid fines, and occasionally even lost property over hygiene violations. Dirt wasn't celebrated. It was fought with whatever tools they had. Historical fact. London's city records from the 14th century show fines for dumping refuse into the Thames or blocking drainage ditches. Quirky tidbit: in some towns, officials known as muckrakers or scavengers patrolled the streets, making sure waste was collected and carried beyond the walls. Debate. Historians still argue whether these laws were effective or mostly symbolic. Some say enforcement was rare. Others point to court rolls filled with fines as proof that the system worked, if unevenly. Step into the sandals of a town crier. He bellows an ordinance in the square. No one shall throw dung in the high street under penalty of 2 shillings. Around him, merchants grumble but take note, knowing their neighbors will report them if they ignore it. Civic pride and neighborly spite combined to enforce the law. Callback. Remember that night rakers we met during the plague years? Those early sanitation workers existed because laws required them. Hygiene wasn't a free choice. It was, at least in theory, a civic duty. Joke 1. Medieval street sign, mind your head. And the chamber pot. Joke 2. Neighborhood watch. More like neighborhood sniff test. Joke 3. City motto, keep London tidy or pay dearly. By the late Middle Ages, some cities even regulated how butchers disposed of offal, ordering them to carry it to designated pits. Water supply, too, was watched, with fines for polluting wells or fountains. It wasn't modern sanitation, but it was an early blueprint of it. So while mud and muck remained, law and order pushed back. Dirt wasn't lawless. It was managed, taxed, and occasionally punished. Cliffhanger. But what did foreign travelers think when they arrived? Did they see law-abiding cleanliness, or did their noses confirm the worst myths? That's where we turn next. The myth suggests every outsider who set foot in medieval Europe recoiled in disgust, scribbling letters about unbearable stench and filth. You imagine ambassadors fainting at banquets, merchants holding cloths to their noses, and pilgrims writing home, "Pray for me, this land reeks." If true, foreign visitors would have avoided Europe like a plague long before the plague arrived. But here's the flip. Travel accounts are mixed. Some outsiders mocked European hygiene, yes, but others described surprisingly neat customs. Clean clothes, washed hands, perfumed chambers, all noted with curiosity. Travelers often exaggerated filth to flatter their own cultures, not because conditions were uniformly terrible. Historical fact. Arab traveler Usama ibn Manshid wrote in the 12th century that Franks Europeans were odd in their bathing habits, but not universally dirty, sometimes even too fond of hot water for his taste. Quirky tidbit. 15th century Italian merchants in London complained less about dirt and more about the bland food, proving hygiene wasn't always their main concern. Debate. Historians still argue how much of the smelly European stereotype was genuine and how much was cultural rivalry. Some accounts emphasize stink, others praise neatness. Step into the mind of a Venetian trader. He sits in a London inn, jotting notes by candlelight. The beds are coarse, the meat is boiled, yet the linens are clean and freshly aired. His words preserve both complaint and reluctant respect. Callback. Remember that myth of rotting clothes we just tore apart? Travelers often noticed the opposite: fresh linen, carefully washed, even if outer garments looked patched or shabby. Joke 1. Travel Review, 1300s edition. 3 stars. Room smelled better than the fish market. Joke 2. Yelp for bathhouses. Too steamy to read the reviews. Joke 3. Tourist tip. When in doubt, follow your nose to the nearest herb stall. These accounts remind us hygiene was partly in the eye or nose of the beholder. What smelled strange to a visitor might smell normal to a native. Cultural expectation shaped perception as much as dirt did. Cliffhanger. But even if travelers quibbled, one thing is clear: the habit of bathing did decline. Why did medieval Europe, once steaming with bathhouses, suddenly give them up? That's the last myth we unravel. The final myth insists medieval Europeans abandoned bathing forever, sealing themselves into centuries of filth until the Renaissance swooped in with soap. The story goes that plague fear, superstition, and ignorance killed cleanliness entirely, leaving people to stink their way through history. You imagine shuttered bathhouses, nobles plugging their noses, and peasants resigned to dirt as destiny. But here's the flip. Bathing did decline in some regions, but not as a universal, permanent collapse. The 14th century brought plague paranoia, yes, and some physicians warned that hot baths opened pores to disease. Religious reformers also targeted bathhouses, claiming they doubled as immoral meeting places. The decline wasn't about abandoning water altogether. It was about fear, morality, and shifting habits. Historical fact: city records in 15th century Germany show bathhouses closing or being repurposed, often on the orders of councils citing plague fears. Quirky tidbit: despite closures, private tubs remained in noble homes, with servants hauling hot water for lords and ladies. Debate: historians still argue whether ordinary people truly bathed less, or whether the decline applied mostly to urban centers where moral authorities had more control. Step inside a city in the late 1400s. Once busy bathhouse doors are barred, their chimneys cold. A family instead fills a wooden barrel in their courtyard, children splashing as neighbors glance nervously. Bathing hasn't vanished, has retreated into private spaces. Callback. Remember the rose oil from our noblewoman, the river baths of peasants, the linen bleaching in meadows. Those practices endured, cleanliness adapted, even if public baths declined. Joke 1. Medieval hot tub. A barrel, a bucket, and no neighbors watching. Joke 2. Bathhouse closed for plague try, again next century. Joke 3. New health advice: stay dirty, stay safe. Results may vary. So the myth of eternal filth hides a more subtle story. Bathing waned for a time, reshaped by fear and morality, but it never disappeared. And by the Renaissance, new fashions, new perfumes, and new soaps revived the habit. The great myth they never bathed crumbles. Medieval people weren't sparkling clean by modern standards, but they weren't the swamp monsters legend made them either. The myths have unraveled. The noise of medieval markets faded. Imagine quiet streets after dusk, torches flickering low, and the faint scent of herbs from a laundress's basket. Your mind softens, not with shock, but with calm recognition that people long ago struggled, just as we do, to feel clean, to feel human. Let your breath slow. Picture the ripples of a river, the steam of a bathhouse, the hush of linen drying in twilight. These aren't just stories, they're rhythms, as steady as your heartbeat now. As you drift, remember, subscribing before you sleep means tomorrow's history will find you waiting. Miss it, and the thread breaks. Stay with the story. Stay in the circle. Now close your eyes, sink into the quiet, and let history itself rock you toward rest.